I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respect to elders and traditional knowledge holders. So today it is my bittersweet pleasure to introduce Katie in her completion seminar. Bittersweet because this is more of a farewell than normal for a completion seminar. Katie is going back to Toronto at the end of the month. She completed her bachelor's in computer science at Queen's in Canada with a specialization in cognitive science. And since 2021, she's been working on a joint PhD at Toronto and here at Melbourne. So I think the joint PhD has meant double the paperwork, but I also hope that it's doubled the number of friends and supporters that you have met along the way. Katie spent the first year or so in Toronto, and from 2023 on, she's been here in the Complex Human Data Hub and quickly became a central member of the hub. So I know that she's helped various people here in different ways. She has been a dedicated tutor. She has also been president of GRIPS, which is organization for grad students in psychology. So I won't say too much about Katie's work because she's going to do that in detail, but I will say that I think of her work as being in the best tradition of cognitive science. She draws on multiple disciplines, including psychology, computer science, NLP, information science, and uses a range of methods, including computational analyses of naturally occurring data and behavioral experiments in psychology. So Katie, over to you.
All right. So what I study is category systems, and this is any system where you just divide the world into kind of separate groups where you're treating the items in the category as equivalent and the things not in the category as distinct for some reason. And category systems, they can be cultural, so like the set of categories we carry around in our heads and often expressed through language, but they can also be institutional, and that these kind of prescribed systems created by like organizations or groups to kind of have a specific purpose. So for plants, I've got the system of plants that I kind of think about in my head, and it's like I have words like bushes and weeds, whereas the kind of scientific taxonomy of plants looks very different and kind of explores different relationships between the things it's meant to categorize. And so category systems also don't form all at once. They change over time to accommodate a changing environment and a changing understanding of the knowledge that of our knowledge of the environment. So if you look at the Dewey Decimal System, when it was first introduced, the predominant view was that fungi was a type of plant, and so it was classified there. But then as our understanding of fungi as a distinct kingdom changed, our category systems didn't initially catch up. We still kept them with kind of plants and botany because of this kind of early category decision and this early understanding of them. And although we were eventually able to revise it, it kind of shows that like as our environments change and as our knowledge changes, the kind of fit of our category systems for these environments can also change and become somewhat skewed. So that's kind of the background for all of this. What I want to do with my thesis is kind of look at category systems on two dimensions. So I've introduced cultural and institutional, and I just use synthetic to mean any study of category systems that's done in the lab, where you kind of create these like, they are examples of category systems, but they're not necessarily ones you would find out in nature. And then specifically, I'm interested in two aspects of them. I'm interested in studying how they are structured and how they kind of evolve and change over time to accommodate a changing environment. So I do that with three projects. I mostly focus on institutional category systems and how they are structured, but I also look at how they change over time with a lab experiment, and also look a little bit at the structure of these more cultural category systems. And to kind of give the projects more concrete names, two of them look at structure by looking at how bias is encoded in the structure of the systems, and the third looks at evolution. And so I'll start by talking about the first. So categorization is inevitably subjective. It reflects our needs, our perspectives, and our biases, and encodes this into its structure. So this pet category system would reflect my kind of understanding of pets, in that I have a lot of experience with cats, and so I have a much more detailed category system for them than I might have for dogs or for fish. And categorization being subjective is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means we give more attention to the things that matter or the things that are relevant in our environments, but it can also have consequences when it like encodes harmful biases or kind of presents these skewed perceptions of the world. And so specifically, I want to look at how subjective categorization encodes bias. And so to do this, first, there's a lot of definitions of bias in psychology literature. We take a very broad definition where we say bias is just the preferential treatment for one group over another in a category system. So in my pet category system, this would be a preferential treatment of cats over fish. And this definition can be applied to the internal nodes of a category system and also the items that kind of lie at its leaves, but I'll specifically just focus on how the category structure encodes this kind of bias. So to do this, I look at library classification systems, and I do this for a number of reasons. One is that they are actual examples of human category systems that are much more accessible than the ones we carry around in our heads because we write them all down. And like we have this very detailed kind of record of the categories we've created and how they've changed with time. They also contain very well documented biases. They have very broad coverage of the world, and also just they're kind of interesting in their own right because they affect how we like access and perceive knowledge. So understanding how they encode bias is important for those reasons. And the specific bias I look at is Western bias, because this has been very well documented in these two US-based classification systems, the Library of Congress, or the LCC, and the Dewey Decimal System, or the DDC. Both of these were created in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, and are meant to classify the kind of range of literature that exists in the US, but also in the world. And previous approaches have focused on bias in the category labels, or how kind of they have different coverage and access to different topics, but I'm specifically interested in how Western bias is encoded in the system's category structure. So this is an example of religion in the Dewey Decimal System. It has many, many categories for Christianity and a few other categories for other things. And how we study it is we take categories and we kind of using some sources about what counts as Western or non-Western, we'll tag them as Western with red or non-Western with blue. And so with religion, you get something or that looks like this, where there's a lot of Western topics and not so many non-Western ones. And we do this specifically for religion, as shown here, language and literature, and then history as well, as these are kind of categories that have these kind of Western and non-Western biases encoded in them. And so what we mean by bias is at a high level, it's how these categories are represented, but we divide it into kind of three distinct kinds of bias, and I'll focus on two of them. So the first is count bias, and this is simple. If you have more red or Western categories than non-Western categories, the system is imposing a Western count bias. Level bias is distinct in that even if you have the same number of Western or non-Western categories, if the Western categories occur higher in the taxonomy than the non-Western ones, then they're being presented as more general and kind of the non-Western ones being presented as more niche or specific. And so that is a second kind of bias. We also introduced descendant bias, but I won't be discussing that in this talk. And then we also kind of define a starting node, which is just the first category that can be tagged as Western or non-Western within the hierarchy. So those are the two examples there. And so Western category bias. So first we look at count bias in the Library of Congress and the Dewey Decimal System for religion, language and literature, and history. And overwhelmingly, we find that there are significantly more Western categories than non-Western ones, especially for religion, where the bars are much bigger, and especially in the Dewey Decimal System, where the differences are starker. In terms of level bias, along the x-axis, we have the depth of the starting node, and then the y-axis is the percentage of nodes that start at that depth. And so again, in the Dewey Decimal System for religion and language and literature, we have this kind of very strong level bias where the Western categories are much higher in the tree than the non-Western ones. And we find it a little bit for language and literature in the Library of Congress and visually for religion, but because there's way less categories that we can tag in the Library of Congress, we don't really find statistically significant differences. But biases exist in these systems, and we are able to use these definitions of bias to kind of look at the different ways it manifests and compare them to one another. So the Dewey Decimal System seems to display a much stronger Western bias than the Library of Congress. But you could be saying that, okay, but these are both two US-based classification systems. they display Western bias because the collection of books they're meant to represent displays a Western bias. So there's more Western books, so more Western categories. And so that would be, we would call that a bias that is external to the system versus a bias that is internal to the system, where the structure is actually kind of exaggerating or imposing this bias on the books beyond what they have in their representation. So we only look at this for count bias as an example, but you can kind of imagine if this is the percentage of books assigned to Western and non-Western categories, and then we look at this for the different subtopics. If the bias was like external, you can imagine the red and the blue dots would be very close together, regardless of their percentages. Whereas if it was internal, they'd be far apart, whether or not the blue or the red comes first. But specifically, if they're exaggerating this Western bias, then the percentage of books per node would be larger for the blue dot than for the red dot. And so we plot that just as the dots along the axis, and we draw a line between them just to kind of show what the distance looks like. And again, we find that generally, I mean, they're very small percentages, but that's because there's a lot of books spread across a lot of categories. But the percentage of books per nodes is larger for the non-Western than the Western ones in most of the categories, and especially for religion. So although it's not like, obviously the system is biased because the books are biased, it doesn't explain the whole picture, and the system is kind of exaggerating this bias or skewing the bias that exists in the world. So we could use these definitions we've defined to look at biases in category systems. But what about not library classification systems? Because we'd like to suggest that these kind of frameworks we have for bias can be applied more generally to other institutional category systems, and even these kind of more cultural, kind of harder to access category systems. And we do that kind of, we drew from the idea that like, it's attested in the literature that agricultural societies tend to have more names for plants than hunter-gatherer societies. We couldn't quite investigate that directly, but there's also something that suggests that they would also have a much more detailed categorization of domestic mammals than wild mammals, despite domestic mammals accounting for less than 1% of mammal species, but accounting for like a lot of our experience with mammals and animals. And so we look at this by kind of looking at word net concepts and seeing it kind of turning them into a hierarchy. And we do find a count bias where there's more categories for domestic mammals than wild ones, but we don't really find a level bias. So they are occurring at the same depth. But this is just meant to illustrate that these measures can be applied to things beyond library classification systems. So we've developed a framework for conceptualizing bias and the structure of a hierarchical category system, which enables comparison between systems and also provides a basis for kind of comparing them to one another. And we believe this is important from like a psychological perspective, but also just from like a general perspective, because category systems, like they affect how we interact with the world, and kind of how we categorize things changes how we view them and like what gets resources. So like there's some work that finds that birds that are like small brown birds are kind of get much less attention and resources because in our category system, we have a much more detailed categorization of like the salient and aesthetically pleasing birds. So it has wide reaching effects. So that's one kind of bias in the category structure. But there's also a lot of literature to suggest that there's bias in the labels of a category system or in like the subcategories it chooses to include or not include. And so our next project looks at the category labels and kind of how they can encode gender bias in other institutional category systems. And so we base this on the idea of typicality effects. So some members of a category are more representative than others. For birds, cassowaries are a much worse example of a bird to me than a robin would be. If you're Canadian, ice hockey is a much better example of hockey than field hockey. And if you're Australian, maybe that's different. But typicality often manifests with language. So we tend to label the atypical members with kind of the attributes that make them distinct from other members of the category. And so it kind of shows up in our language. And this bias can come from frequency. So I have more experience with robins, so I see them as more typical, but it can also come from social biases or kind of stereotypes of like who is a more typical member of a category. And so one kind of very big example is the people equals male bias. And this is the idea that men are the more typical or default example of a category member. So in the case of a grad student, Merrick would be a grad student, and I might be a female grad student. So we kind of want to explore this typicality bias by looking at asymmetries in labeling or the existence of gendered subcategories in a couple category systems. And so we did this with a body of work where we looked at the Library of Congress subject headings, or the LCSH, which are related to but distinct from the Library of Congress classification in that they're like just meant to describe the topics books can be about. We look at the categories in Wikipedia, and then as a baseline, we compare frequencies in gendered language use and Google Ngram. And our goal is to compare these kind of asymmetries in these systems to asymmetries in language use, and then specifically use subgroups of like identities, which we mean like nationalities and ethnicities, to look at the extent to which this like people equals male bias exists, but also we look at jobs to see if the frequency of men and women in various jobs can also account for some of these asymmetries. So we find all categories that contain the words men, women, male, female. If there's terms for women but not men, we group them as W. Terms for men but not women, we group them as N. And terms for both women and men, then we group them as WN, and we find subsets for jobs and identities. And so first, we ask, how do the gender biases in the Library of Congress and Wikipedia compare to language use? And both of them really the Library of Congress really exaggerates this asymmetry when compared to language use, whereas Wikipedia kind of exaggerates it, but not as strongly, in that in the Library of Congress, most of the categories relating to people mention women and do not mention men at all. Wikipedia, it's a bit more balanced. And Ngram, we kind of decide the boundaries based on like, if the difference in frequency is about like 40 to 60%, we label that as like women and men. And if it's bigger or smaller, then it gets purple or yellow. And so when we compare these with a regression, we find that categories for women are about 2 times more likely in the Library of Congress than in language use, whereas in Wikipedia, they're less than 1 times more likely. So the Library of Congress really exaggerates this bias, where Wikipedia kind of reflects it more accurately. And then looking at jobs and identities specifically, we can see that overwhelmingly, the Library of Congress really exaggerates what we find in language use, whereas Wikipedia either just kind of mirrors it, or in the case of identities, actually tries to mitigate it such that there's like most of their categories for like nationalities and ethnicities have both a label for men and women. So they're trying to balance that presentation at least. Does the people equals male bias drive gender asymmetries? Definitely in the Library of Congress. For something like Canadians, there should be like roughly 50-50 men and women. So when you're just labeling Canadian women, but not Canadian men, that suggests it's this like people equals male bias that's driving it. We also kind of find it in language use, but not really in Wikipedia. When we ask if Bayes rates predict biases in job categories, we look at, from 2015, the actual percentage of women and men in jobs in the US, and then we also look at people's perceptions of the percentage of women and men in the US. And so if we take an example like accountant, the actual percentage of women is 62%. And so the dot would be about here, and maybe according to our definition should actually be labeled with M because there's more women than men. Or maybe it's balanced because it's like kind of close to 50. The perceived percentage of women is 37%, so it would be down here, and maybe it would get the purple label. So depending what's driving it, if it's the actual or perceived percentage, we can see kind of what leads to these kind of the gender asymmetries in this language, and across all systems, they get the W label, which suggests that it's this perceived percentage of women in a field that's driving these asymmetries. And when we do that for a larger amount of jobs in these two systems and in language, we find that it's the perceived percentage of women that seems to better account for these disparities, although it's hard to know for sure because there's just not that many categories for men overall, so we can't really see what's driving that. But if we do like a regression that predicts the W, WM, or M labels from these perceived and actual percentages, for both the Library of Congress and Wikipedia, the perceived percentages is a better predictor than the actual, whereas in Ngram, neither of them perform better than the null model. So at least in these category systems, our perception of women and men's in these fields is at least in part driving these asymmetries. So we kind of looked at a different form of bias and looked at how gender and typicality manifest in real world settings. And we can demonstrate how institutional category systems can reflect, exaggerate, or mitigate these biases. But we also use institutional systems to test theoretical ideas about categorization at a very large scale. So we can look at like Bayes rates and typicality and actually test these in these institutional systems that we have access to. So bias. These category systems are biased. They present skewed representations of the world. And I guess one explanation could be that as like kind of early category decisions maybe reflect biased worldviews at the time. And because as they evolve, we're kind of building on existing structures instead of creating them from scratch. And when we're originally creating them, we don't have access to like the full environment and our full understanding of the environment. So one reason they could become biased is kind of due to these kind of incremental evolutionary processes where they must be encountered sequentially and not all at once. We don't specifically look at bias here, but we look at the process of how these systems evolve more generally, and that could account for some of the bias we see. So now we're looking at how category systems evolve. So category systems aren't formed all at once. They change as our knowledge of the environment changes or our experience with the environment changes. As we kind of were able to use microscopes and look at genes, our understanding of the kind of kingdom of or all the living things changed. And so evolution is traditionally used to kind of look at how kind of things evolve by a cultural evolution, but we're just looking at it kind of to ask, how do category systems adapt to a changing environment encountered over time? So it could be something encountered in one person's lifetime or in like the lifespan of an institutional system, which is much longer, or in a 10-minute experiment, as we will later show. So to kind of come up with ideas for the experiment, we look to literature on sequence effects, which really scales down. But it's this idea that the order in which we encounter our environment affects how we categorize things. It's traditionally been studied in how it affects our ability to learn categories or like what features we divide things on based on the order that we see them in, but it also affects where the category boundaries are drawn, which is the most interesting part to us. How does kind of your experience with your environment change how you divide the things in your environment? And so, but that's not quite exactly what we're getting at, because we want to see how people incorporate new things into an existing hierarchy. And these tend to not be hierarchical, and they tend to be smaller, simpler systems. So kind of to illustrate what we're looking at, we have kind of a very simple example. So imagine you exist in a world of like maybe shells, and the items on the left are small shells, the item on the right are big shells, and you have this existing category system for the shells. And there's a set of items or shells that you have never seen before that exist somewhere between the left and the right categories that you have yet to categorize. And so you can imagine that if you saw shell 1 first and were to see them from left to right, then you might put your first shell with category L because of its similarity with the existing items. And then as you see subsequent shells, you start to put them all into category L because the earlier decisions pull the later ones towards that category. But if you were to see them starting with shell 5, then you might actually end up putting them all into category R with the big shells. And so the same set of shells change how the same set of shells are categorized depending on when you encounter them. And then even if you were to see the middle shell first, you might actually give it its own category because it's equally dissimilar to the left and the right shells. And then put all of these shells into the new category. And so order would affect the actual taxonomy that you create. But in the system, the kind of new shells are equally dissimilar from the left and the right categories. So I would say like none of the systems are like necessarily better or worse than the others. But if you were to simulate it a bunch of times and like you plot the proportion of shells assigned to the categories, you might get something that looks like this. So differences in category assignment based on the order that you encounter them. But now you can imagine that these shells are shifted so that they're actually closer to the shells in category L. And again, if you see shell 1 first, you're probably going to put them all with L. And I would say that's probably maybe the best way to categorize this space, in my opinion. But if you were to see them from right to left, you might actually put the first shell either in its own new category or with the shells in R, or maybe you create a system where like these shells are split between category L and R. The main thing I want to illustrate is that I think these the two category systems on the left, right, that's the last two category systems are worse than the first one you create if you were to see them from left to right. And if you were to simulate this, you might see differences in kind of the plots than you would for the centered condition, but you would still see this strong order effect where if you see them in one way, you're putting most of the items with L, and if you see them in different ways, you're putting most of them in different other places. But then again, I'm interested in hierarchical category systems, and these aren't very hierarchical. They're pretty flat. So you can imagine a slightly less simple scenario where the system now gets not much bigger, but it's got an extra level of categorization where L and R are subdivided into smaller categories, like very small and less small shells, and then very big and just big shells, or something like that. Now, with the new shells coming in, your kind of options of where you can put things kind of explodes a little bit. So now, like, I can put a new shell into an existing subcategory. I can put it in a new subcategory. I can put it in a new top level category, and so on and so on. And what we kind of take away from this example is that as the system gets a more detailed categorization, new categories higher in the taxonomy might become less likely just because there's now way more options to add it at the bottom than there is at the top. And maybe if you were to simulate it, you'd see, compared to the we call them the two-level situations we looked at earlier, you might see this disparity in items categorized at a depth of 2 versus 3. But we'll find out. So that's kind of what we want to illustrate. And we want to illustrate this with both a model that simulates how hierarchical category systems adapt to a changing environment, but also design an experiment to test this. And specifically, we want to look for scenarios where the order in which you encounter the environment leads to suboptimal systems in both our model and for our participants. So first, okay. Oh, was that not on the screen? Anyways. So first we introduce our computational model. And so this is kind of based on the idea that optimal category systems maximize within category similarity and between category dissimilarity. And models exist that kind of do this. We have rational models of categorization that use Bayesian inference to determine the most likely category for an item, and they can be used sequentially, but they're often not hierarchical and not that easy to adapt to our specific situation. So we decided to introduce a new explicitly hierarchical model. Yeah, to satisfy these things we have need for. So to do this, we look to the kind of clustering literature in computer science, where they have all these objectives that are kind of used to cluster stimuli into hierarchical category systems. And so this objective is called the CKMM objective. And basically, what it's trying to do is maximize this within category similarity and between category dissimilarity by multiplying the distance between items by the size of the kind of smallest category that they share. So what this means more concretely is if you just look at items A, B, and C, and the distance between A and B is 1, A and C is 5, and B and C is 6. And then you look at the categories that they share. So for A and B, they only share a category at the root, so the size of the category is 9. For A and C, they share this little category, so the size of the category is 3, and then B and C, again, only share the category system at the root. So again, the size of the smallest common category they share is 9, and when you add that all up, you get a category like 78. But spoiler, A is a different color from and more like the colors in R. So now if you were to switch its categorization, and now the size of the category that A and B share is 3, and then the categories that A and C and B and C share is bigger, we get a bigger number. So by multiplying things that are very distant with big categories, so multiplying big things with big things and small things with small things, you get to maximize this objective. And how we turn this into a sequential model is basically we use a softmax layer to make it probabilistic and kind of use that probability to determine the most likely existing or new category that this item belongs through. We use temperature to control how deterministic choices are. So is it often always putting it in the best place, or is it choosing some less good places more frequently? And then we also assume that people are going to make some amount of random choices. So we use alpha to control the degree of choices that are just random. So based on a uniform distribution across the options you have. So that's our model. Our experiment is kind of trying to make a situation that this model would work well for. And so we first start In the experiment, we vary the location of novel stimuli that we present to participants. So like in the examples I had earlier, they can be equally dissimilar from L and R, closer to L, or a new scenario where they're closer to R just to balance things out. We vary the order in that they're presented in the forwards, so from left to right, backwards, which is right to left, or a middle outwards order where they kind of go from the middle item and then like alternate from the items outwards to see how sequence affects presentation. And then we use an all at once condition where they just have to put everything in the category system as like a baseline to compare the sequence conditions against. Finally, we vary the depth of the system. So either there's a root category and categories L and R, or there's those two levels of categorization plus additional subcategorization of L and R into these smaller, more defined categories. More specifically, we asked participants to complete 4 trials where they incorporate the stimuli into existing category systems. So they do one of each sequence and then one of the all-at-once condition, and we balance the depths and the kind of locations that they see these stimuli in. And so that they're not learning kind of the space of stimuli they're being asked to categorize, we create 4 sets of stimuli that vary uniformly along a feature dimension and are kind of meant to well, they're not meant to be perceptually uniform, but we've tried to define them so that their midpoint is kind of avoiding perceptual attractors like a right angle or being like the exact middle line. It doesn't work perfectly. People are sensitive to the different stimuli that they categorize, but it doesn't really change the results we get. What this looks like more concretely is like kind of they see a category system. They're asked to familiarize themselves with it. They're shown an item in the top corner, and they have to click on the place that they want to incorporate it. So this item might want to put into a new category, so I'd click that, and I'd put it here, and I do that so on and so on until I've categorized all the items, and I click Finish. All at once, they just appear at the top, and we drag and drop them to the categories that we like. In the end, we had 386 participants complete this experiment successfully, and that meant we had 1,544 trials to draw from across all our conditions. And we were specifically, so the first thing we wanted to look at is in the centered condition, how does order affect categorization? And specifically, how does it affect assignment to categories L, R, and X? Although in like the 2nd and 3-level cases, there's like these subcategories that differ. We only look at kind of how order affects the kind of 2nd-level categorization in both scenarios, just so that they can be comparable. But exploration at the 3rd level would be interesting future work. But in our simulations, we see that items are more likely to be assigned to category L in the forwards order than in the backwards order, R in the backwards than the forwards order, and X in the middle order when compared to the forward or the backwards orders. And then if we look at that for our participants, and because it's not on the slide, pink is L, yellow is R, and blue is a new category X. But our participants, we had the simulation, so it was for the same number of trials, and we find kind of less stark effects than our model, but still we find some order effects. Specifically, there's a significant difference in the percentage of items assigned to L in the forwards when compared to the backwards order, and to R in the backwards when compared to the forward order. However, we don't find a significant difference when comparing the middle items assigned to X in the middle order than the forwards or the backwards order. But still, order affects what the systems look like, as you can see by looking at the diagram. When we shift these left, our simulations, there's a lot of effects, but the one we're most interested in is that forwards order means more items assigned to L than backwards order. For our participants, we find that this is a significant difference. And then for the right, we're interested in the reverse, which is that more R in the backwards than the forward. And for our participants, we again see this with a significant difference when comparing the two. So order effects exist, order matters, the category systems we create change with the order in which we present stimuli. But the other thing we are interested in is hierarchy. So does the percentage of times people create a new category X change? So that's a new 2nd-level category. They might be creating new categories at like the 3rd kind of subcategory level, but we're interested in how it affects this top category creation because that's consistent between both conditions. And so according to our model, there's a significant difference between the creation of categories when the system has 2 levels than when it has 3 levels. And maybe unsurprisingly, we find the same result for our participants. And it looks pretty similar to the model. And especially when we keep the number of participants consistent. So the depth of your category system or the existing structure of your system affects where you add new items and kind of the amount of detail that they're categorized with. So we find effects of order and we find effects of the existing structure of the system. The final thing we are interested about is optimality. Which systems lead to this highest score that we've defined? And so this is the equation we used. And we assume that one, participants are going to create the best system when they see the items all at once because they have access to the full space of stimuli. And then we assume that they're going to create the worst systems when the items are left shifted but seen in the backwards order, or right shifted but seen in the forwards order. And so for each row, we offset them by the lowest CKMM score. So if the two things very faintly highlighted in pink get 0, then that means they're making the worst systems. And yeah, they're making the worst systems. So yay, we did find that was the case. And then filling in the other things, the scores aren't that different. The subjective, I don't know. It's a very weird number. Like they're very big and have small differences, but the systems are better in these kind of other conditions to kind of greater and less degrees. However, the all-at-once condition is not creating the best systems. So that was contrary to what we expected. Either it means this objective we've defined is not capturing everything about what makes a system optimal, or it suggests that people aren't necessarily always creating the best system when they see the items all at once. I'm not sure, but it was unexpected but interesting, and so I'd kind of be curious to see what's going on there with more time. So based on our model, at least some of our ideas about optimality are met, but not all of them. For this, well, we have time. So I did mention that rational category models do exist. However, they require a lot of adaptation to fit to our specific scenarios. But we did kind of play around with the existing rational category models, specifically that deterministic one that just maximizes item assignment, and the single particle one, which assigns item probabilistically, and compared it to our existing model. I'm just going to show this. I'm not going to go into much detail for the sake of time, but our models are the orange ones, and compared to a random baseline in both the 2-level and 3-level condition, they're kind of log likelihoods in a 11-fold cross-validation overwhelmingly improve compared to the rational category models. I'm not going to go into detail about all the different ones, but we're basically just testing different aspects of the model, and we find that overall our model better accounts for our data. So we explored how category systems evolve to become suboptimal or optimal representations of their environment. We find that order matters and that sequence effects are present in the system at varying levels of complexity or hierarchy, and also regardless of how similar these items are to existing categories. We also suggest through our model comparisons that we do need models of categorization that are intrinsically hierarchical, because a lot of our kind of conceptual categorization and the category systems that exist in our world are hierarchical. And so models that can capture this are important. And they do exist, but they're way less frequent than the non-hierarchical ones. But of course, I became interested in this because I was looking at how the Dewey Decimal System had kind of changed over time and seemed to become less a worse representation of the space of books as it progressed, because it's really hard to update such a big system, and it's very constrained by early decisions. This is not this, and so future work could hopefully start to extend some of these measures to systems that, even if they're not the Dewey Decimal System, are more complicated. But altogether, I'm interested in kind of using hierarchical category systems to contribute to just a better understanding of human category systems and categorization in general. And I hope that I did that with my 2 projects or 3 projects by looking at how the structures of these systems can encode bias and how they evolve over time to kind of create representations of the world that are skewed or maybe not skewed. And specifically, we developed large-scale methods for measuring bias in these systems to kind of quantify the extent to which they kind of represent skewed versions of the environment. And we also develop an experiment and a model that can start to suggest how they become more or less skewed with time. Future work could kind of, because we still have a lot of dots that are not filled in this table, future work could kind of expand upon this. Like we could do historical versions of the Library of Congress and the Dewey Decimal System exist, so that some project that tracks their actual evolution could be cool to see if like, are they becoming less optimal with time? How are they changing with time? And how does that differ like in this very explicitly written down institutional system when compared to these less explicit systems that just exist in our heads? Because I think they're both examples of categorization, but they also have like important differences in that an institutional category system is not designed for any one person to be able to remember, whereas our cultural systems are meant to kind of be able to exist in our heads. And so how that leads to different systems, I think could be a really cool thing to look at next. We could also do more things on the structure and looking at just using our measures of optimality to see how optimal these institutional systems are. And we could also start to combine some of these dimensions by trying to use a lab experiment that can induce category biases through these evolutionary processes. So although we've only kind of bitten off a chunk of this space with my PhD, I think there's a lot of like, it opens a lot of avenues for interesting future research that I would hope to do at some point. But I think I want to close by saying why this all matters. So the first is that institutional category systems are examples of human categorization. So I think they're interesting to psychologists and cognitive scientists for those reasons alone, but they are often underexplored. And so the more work we do on them, the more kind of broad or holistic our understanding of human categorization will be. But also for like non-psychology related reasons, institutional systems and just any category system that exists in our head or out in the world, it shapes how we think, how we communicate and access information. So understanding how these systems become skewed and the ways in which they kind of create these more or less optimal perceptions of the world is very important for just how we kind of understand how these systems encode our biases and how we engage with the world around us. So that's it. Oh, yes. I want to say thank you to my supervisors. This would not exist without them. And they've put up with me for 4.5 years and have been very lovely. And yeah, it's been just been a joy to work with them and get to be in like 2 universities and 3 labs. I think it's a really unique experience. And I'm really happy that I got the chance to do it. And also, because I get to be with 3 groups, I get to meet a whole ton of people that I get to spend time with. And I think people can really make or break the PhD, and I've been lucky to just have so many lovely people around me. And also, I want to say thank you to my family and for my parents for like listening to me talk about this all the time and just prattle on over the phone about the research I do. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. Yes. And to all the cats I got to cat sit. Um, also, thank you.
We have time for questions. Would you like to take your own?
Yeah, I can take my own. If you can monitor the chat, Elizabeth. Thank you. Oh boy, actually, I'll start with Dan.
So when it was interesting that the people who saw all the stimuli in the actual experiment, ended up with less optimal categories. I was wondering if you looked at what order people chose
Yeah.
to categorize.
So I do track that just because my model is sequential. So like to fit our model to the all at one participants, we do have to track the order that they add them to. And yeah, I think that's probably why. I think it's because we always categorize in sequence. And even though we can see everything, we're still kind of constrained by the first choices we make. They were allowed to change their mind in the all at once condition, so they could put something in L and then later put it in R. But just glancing at the data, most people didn't. They stuck with their first choice and went with it. So yeah, I haven't looked at it in detail, but yeah, I think that could explain some of what we see. Yeah. Yeah.
Whether people tend to categorize things that are like the closest to one of the categories first.
Yeah.
Maybe something further away.
Yeah, and they're like, well, yeah, because there's also in every trial we have these distractors that are meant to be like really clear examples of L and R. So they're not actually distractors, but we do use them to exclude people. But also we use them just to see are they at least paying attention to the stimuli? And I found I always categorize them first. I didn't ask participants, but I'd be curious to see if they were putting like the really clear examples into these categories first and then going from there. Yeah, thank you. Courtney,
Yeah, really amazing.
thank you.
Place here. So my question, in terms of thinking of like the implications of this and like where it might go next and all of that sort of thing, have you thought much about how these sorts of category biases and the evolution of those categories applies to the categories we use within psychology itself? Because there's been a lot of interest over the last like couple decades about how the people we study in psychology tend to be very narrow slices.
Yes.
And more recently, there's, I think, been growing attention on not only a lack of diversity in who we study, but like, I guess a lack of diversity of who studies people and the biases they bring, how we might be missing on looking at things certain ways. Yeah, have you thought much about that application?
Not a little bit. One, because I guess some of the literature suggests that like Western category systems are much more hierarchical than non-Western ones. Although for me, I guess hierarchy just means that there's like a more general category that encompasses a more specific one, whether that's like a specific taxonomic relationship or like a part-whole relationship, like a thumb is a part of a hand. But I think like I've mostly just studied Western library systems, the English language, and University of Melbourne undergrads and prolific participants. So my sample hasn't been that diverse, but I think like I would like access to like there's a kind of very prominent Chinese classification system, a library classification system, and I think seeing how that differs from the Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress, and kind of putting our measures onto that could be a good test of whether or not they're like capturing these biases, because you wouldn't expect it to have as strong of a Western bias. I think some of our methods could be used to measure variation, but of course that means we need to have access to like diverse groups of people, and we need to actually study diverse groups of people. I don't know if that actually answers your question, but I have thought about it. It's just, yeah, kind of how to implement it. I'm not as sure. Yeah. Because, yeah, I know this library classification system exists, but I can't find it to the same detail that I've found the Library of Congress and the Dewey Decimal System. Yeah. Andy?
Yeah, so it's kind of the conjunction of your appendix 2 and 3, the category label thing. I find myself wondering how this might differ, the category label effect, where so in English you have a term and then the gender makes it as a marked term on it, right?
Yes.
But in some languages, the gender is just part of the morphology.
Yeah.
And there's not the same marked to unmarked difference. And so I was wondering if you might expect either differences in how institutional systems that reflect those languages are set up.
Yeah.
Also how they evolve, because it's less, stuck or like anchored maybe. I don't know. I was wondering if you know of any work on that or what you might predict.
I knew someone who was studying it more in terms of like actor, actress, so specifically gendered terms in the English language that aren't created with a modifier. I haven't looked at detail what they have found. I knew someone who was looking at like gender biases in French, but they were more looking at how like it's often technology words that get like when new words are introduced, technology words tend to be gendered as male and other words tend to be gendered as women. So there are these biases affecting what words, like not overwhelmingly, like obviously there's a lot of words that are counter to our stereotypes, but as new words come in, our biases do affect these things. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it, but I think it would differ. I haven't looked at it in much detail. Yeah. Tam.
A very specific question.
Okay.
So for the last project, model simulations in this.
Yeah.
Why model that we all stimuli at once for the forward was overall ultimately.
Yeah.
And the leftward one, but for the right backward one, all at one was higher.
Yeah. So one, the model didn't see them all at once because our model was sequential. How we would model like this all at once condition is we just pick a random stimuli to start with, and then averaging that over a bunch of trials, we get something that looks like that. it did look a lot like our participants. So that's to Dan's point. I think that might be what they're doing. They're choosing a random start and categorizing it differently. But why I still would think like they see it all, it's optimal. It could be that it's a fast experiment. They're not paying attention. That like they're paying enough attention to the experiment, but they're not thinking that deeply about, and they're just dragging and dropping things without taking in the full space. Or it's that our objectivity, our measure of objectivity or subjectivity, maybe, sorry, our measure of optimality might just not be capturing everything. But yeah, I thought about it, but I don't have a clear answer yet. Keep Viola. Yeah.
You mentioned about like the French languages. So like, you might not have an answer for this. You could just be like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how do you imagine categorizing things might differ in languages that have gender in them. So for instance,
Yeah.
like in Italian, like every words have like a female or male, right? How do you think that would play out in category system? Because would that maybe trump the kind of cultural biases that people have with certain words if the word is, I don't know, framed as something that's like a female word?
Yeah. I think it's been years, but I remember someone presenting on a study that looked at this, like looking at gendered words in specifically gendered languages versus non-gendered languages, and the effects were different, but I can't remember what they were studying. I think it would trump it in some scenarios. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, for certain.
So we're taking this chance to have a committee meeting for Katie as well. Could I ask everyone who's not in the committee to step outside? But let's first thank Katie.